Hello viewers. Today I'm in conversation with Professor Laura Mulvey, whose seminal work, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, is one of the most cited works so far. She's a film theorist, she's a filmmaker, and today on a very a nice day, 2020, we'll be talking to her about topics which are close to her heart and her book. Thank you, ma'am, for agreeing to do this interview.
Well, thank you very, very much, Asita, for having these questions for me.
Okay, I would like to start with your recent book, After Images. And you begin the book with the chapter title which says The Last Chapter. So what is the closure that you're addressing here?
I wanted to put a line under my long-standing engagement with the question of woman as spectacle, and particularly with woman as spectacle in Hollywood films. So it's something that I found I was going back to in different ways over the years, and I just wanted to bring it to an end. So the first section of my book is called A Last Chapter. But I wanted also to pay a tribute, as it were, to three particular figures who belong to that period. When I wrote Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, the Hitchcock film Vertigo, which came out in 1958, was key to the argument. And over the years, I came to realize that, actually not over the years, just recently, really, I came to realize that the film was more self-reflexive than I'd ever realized. So when I wrote about it in the early 70s, I was writing about it as a film which was just being spectacle. I saw it much more as actually a study of woman as spectacle, and more than that, a study of the construction of the male fetishistic gaze and the male fetishistic obsession. So it was almost as though Hitchcock had understood how crucial this relationship was to the cinema itself. So although the film doesn't cite cinema, there's such a strong allegorical presence of this relationship there that I wanted to acknowledge that. So that was the Vertigo side. I've also written quite a lot about Max Offel's and the beauty of his films and his actual kind of sensitivity towards his female protagonists. And I was... his films are quite varied, but in some of them, one strand, you can see his reflections on, and I mean reflections, literally thoughts about the way in which the image of the woman functions as commodity, as a commodity spectacle to be circulated within the entertainment industry. And once again, his last film, Lola Montez, acts as a kind of allegory for this, set in a circus before the days of the cinema actually existing. He reflected on how the spectacle produced her as an object of gaze, an object of a prurient gaze, and the way that money entered into the whole relationship. So those were two self-reflexive films by old directors, reflecting also on the end of a certain era of filmmaking. Although Offel's had worked in Hollywood during his period of exile, he was back in France, but he was still thinking back on an era that was over.
Okay.
So it was Hollywood on its deathbed.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. That also brings to the next point that I wanted to discuss. You have visited and revisited Marilyn Monroe, and she's something that keeps appearing in your work and in your text. Would you like to comment something very specific to Monroe that helped you to weave her through your work, or which was very significant that you thought that only she could represent and nobody else?
Yes. It begins actually with her absence from visual pleasure and narrative cinema. In a sense, there's something about Marilyn Monroe that's excessive, that's beyond narrative, and is beyond the control of any male protagonist. So I couldn't use her in visual pleasure, where the argument was much more about the control of the male protagonist, his control over the female as spectacle, his control over the narrative drive. So she's absent there. And she only begins to come in later, again, very much in the question of cosmetics,
Yes.
commodity,
And
fetishism,
yes.
and the constructed body of the woman. So the question of cosmetics, it kind of overflows into my discussion of Godard's interest in the woman as constructing herself out of the commodities that she buys in late capitalist society, the way in which she relates to the culture of the cosmetic and of fashion, and the way in which Marilyn Monroe had a sense of her own cosmetic construction. Because, as you know, probably everybody knows, Marilyn Monroe could move around the streets of New York completely anonymously if she was not being Marilyn. And so the construction of the movie star was a very self-conscious production of an image in which she had a certain amount of control, but was at the same time working within a discourse of woman as spectacle. But I was also interested in the way that she tried to take control over her image and the way in which her subordination to the studio, to 20th Century Fox, who really exploited her, was then that at a certain point she rebelled against the control of the studio. She started her own company. The studio had to submit to her demands. And what does she do then? How does she then reconstruct her image? So I was just very interested in the way that in her last film, in The Misfits, she acknowledges the cosmetic nature of her image, but she also dwells on its vulnerability. So it's almost as though in The Misfits she's performing the woman in everyday life who wants to be Marilyn Monroe. And there's a sense of the way in which that flamboyant cosmetic mask, in a sense, protects the vulnerability of the woman in a society in which she is so over-sexualized.
That brings me to one more question that I would like to ask is, you have in your last book, the recent one, that you speak about women and the figuration of motherhood that keeps coming in. Would you like to tell something about the chapter which talks about Mary Callie and the maternal silence in the book?
Yes. Yes. So if the first chapter is called A Last Chapter, say that again. The first section is called A Last Chapter. The second section is called A New Chapter. Because over the years, I've been more preoccupied by analysing the exploitative image of woman than actually writing about how women can make an alternative cinema, although my own cinema, in a sense, works around that question. So this was my first real exploration of this issue, and I focused very particularly on the maternal. So I'm discussing 5 films made by women, going back to the extremely important, innovative, avant-garde work Jeanne Dielman made by Chantal Akerman in the mid-1970s, and up to the very last one, which is the film called The Arbor by Cleo Barnard, made in the UK in 2010. So all these films are circulate around varying figures of the mother. It's not consistent. They have different relationships to motherhood, but they all, in a sense, are approaching the figure of the maternal as emerging out of a silence. And this silence in Mary Kelly's work and in some of my work can be read Freudianly, in that the place of the mother within the Oedipal trajectory is to be left behind in the world of silence, while the child, as it were, reaches the point of language, the law of the father, and is socialized into the world, having broken with the physical relationship with the maternal, which might be, as it were, Edenic, but cannot, as it were, allow this movement into the world. So it was to try and reconfigure that silence into a silence that can be visualized and narrated. But also there's a sense that patriarchal society needs the silence of the woman in order for the voice of the patriarch to be heard loud and clear. And this is an issue that's been discussed recently and becomes very topical, in that women who speak out too vociferously, too strongly in the public space of politics can very often attract an enormous amount of hatred and vilification in all kinds of ways, but nowadays very much through social media. And in the UK there's been quite a lot of discussion about this. But also there's the way in which the voice of the woman needs to find a mode of signifying what has not yet been said. What is the female contribution to culture? What kind of stories, what kinds of poetics can a female sensibility bring to the world? And that's in a sense where the woman's voice isn't just speaking for, put it like this, in this case, the woman's voice doesn't just need to be expressed to overcome oppression, but also to contribute to our collective society and our collective culture, the contribution of women, which has been silenced for so long. So this is, in a sense, what has been lost, that patriarchal society lost these contributions. And one could also extend this beyond the lost voice of woman to the lost voices of other marginalized people who are unable to speak for social and discriminatory class reasons. And so rather than to just think of giving a voice to the oppressed, it's also allowing society to take advantage of what has not yet been said, assuming, as I do, that those modes of expression will bring a new way of relating between people, perhaps a softer way, perhaps a more mediated way, in which violence and violence against women is no longer the way in which the male has to assert itself, but that masculinity itself can find a way of negotiating gender in and be liberated by this new kind of this new culture, new language, which in a sense emerges out of the taboo of the maternal voice.
So we can say that this could perhaps be a new opening in a way that media or technology can have a certain amount of, could enable the spectator to become have more agency, if I may say that.
But it's a struggle, Asita. It's a struggle. And as I've mentioned various times while I've been talking, while I've been here. It was noticeable that in our last election in the UK in December, that a number of very able MPs of both parties, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, were withdrawing from politics because the pressure on them as women in public life overflowed into a pressure on their families, and dealing with the kind of vilification that was brought on women who participate in public discourse was really too much to bear. So that struggle is very much an ongoing one, as well as one that we can explore through women's poetry, women's films, women's modes of expression, which all need, of course, to be brought back into our educational spheres as well as our cultural spheres.
So does it mean that we're going back to the circle of women's movement? Do we need another women's movement?
Yes.
Maybe?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
On that note, I think we can conclude. Thank you so much for doing
you.
this interview.
Thank you.
We hope to have another session.
Thank you.
Thank you.